Hello. I do prefer to talk down here than up there. Forgive me if I pace around, I'll try not to. Can you all hear me down there?
Yes.
That's a relief. Still got those theatre credentials working. Thank you very much for welcoming me here. Start with a couple of apologies. So the first one is, if you came along expecting a rich, dark Scottish accent, I'm afraid you're disappointed, because I am originally from New Zealand. I've lived in Scotland for over 30 years, but somehow it hasn't brushed off very much. But oddly, when I'm in New Zealand, people tend to say that I have an English or a Scottish accent, and when I'm in Scotland, they say, "Oh, you're an Australian, aren't you?" Or occasionally a Canadian, and the more discerning know where I'm really from. And the other apology is, although you're not getting the Scottish accent, this is about as close as you get. I managed to dig out the tartan shirt. And then I had this vague memory that the last time I was in Wellington, which was a year ago, and I met with Eric, I think I was wearing the same shirt, which is it maybe gives the wrong impression. But you're also getting the wild hair, because I've just spent 4 weeks in a theatre doing a project with young people in Auckland, and had no time to go out and get a haircut. And I got up this morning and I thought, I'm doing this presentation at the National Library, and that. So this is about as Scottish as you get, the slightly getting towards the Billy Connolly kind of hair. So I'm originally from Wellington. I grew up here, left when I was 18. I've lived in a variety of places. I was in London, then Aberdeen, and then Edinburgh. And first part of my career, about half of my working life, was as a primary school teacher and then manager. And then my family and I came to live in New Zealand in 2004, and we were here for about 4 years. And I worked at Auckland University as a drama teacher trainer. And since then, since we returned to Scotland for the last 12 years, I have spent about 2/3 of my time in Scotland, working with this stuff I'm going to talk to you about, and the other third back here in New Zealand, continuing to do theatre education stuff, such as these projects in Auckland. So that's my kind of, that's my background, that's where I'm talking from. So I'm not an archivist, I'm an educator, and I got drawn into working in archives through, as you do, a couple of friends. Got back to Scotland, wasn't really sure what I was going to do next, and one of my friends got in touch from the National Archives in Edinburgh and said, "Could you help us put some education materials together?" And it all kind of snowballed from there. So now I work freelance, and my main contract in Scotland is with the Scottish Council on Archives. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the resources that I work on using archive material in that role. And then some of the projects which I've been involved in the last few years, which use archives in schools and community projects. So Scottish Council on Archives is a Scottish government-funded organisation, and its role is purely to support the archives sector in Scotland. We are tasked with promoting the use of archives and promoting the support of archives in local communities, training archivists in new and important areas. The SCA is also responsible for the accreditation of archive services in Scotland, so they have to reach a certain level. The public or private archive has to reach a certain standard of conservation and of education and outreach, and of various other kind of record-keeping things in order to get accreditation. So we manage that program. And about 8 years ago, we branched into education and outreach. This was sort of a pet project by one of the trustees who thought that archive services in Scotland, as probably here, are tasked with a certain public engagement role. And most archive services in Scotland were run by a lone archivist with not another archivist for 60 miles in any direction. And they were expected to run an education and outreach program, as well as all of the other things that they were doing. And people who account for these services, particularly counsellors, local councillors and MPs and so on, tend to judge these public services on footfall and on numbers, metrics of various kinds. And archives were just not generating these numbers. And sometimes they were only there because there was a legislative need for them to be there. So we embarked on an educational thing, which was this. I got drafted in as a consultant to run a couple of pilot projects, which turned into 6 pilot projects, where we took a local archive and a school somewhere in Scotland, and we put them together and we created a project. And the idea was to then assess how did that project go, who contributed what, and what was thrown up that explained why there was not this kind of engagement. To a number of conclusions, so there's a couple of boring slides now with lots and lots of writing on, which you can read or not as you wish. But what you see here is a group of 4th year, up the top there. Is there a, no. Yes? Top one? Ooh, look at that. Okay. So these guys are from a secondary school in Glasgow. They're about 15 years old, art students. And they were producing their art portfolios for their exams. And they used seals and scrolls, 15th century seals and scrolls from Glasgow City Archives as inspiration for pieces of artwork. And they produced some fabulous pieces of work, some of which 8 years later are still on display in Glasgow City Archives. This one here, remember that one? There we go. This one here is a nursery class, also in Glasgow. I was a bit dubious about somebody running an archives-based education project with a nursery class, so nursery, early childhood, so these were 3 or 4-year-olds. But the lady who ran it had this brilliant idea of using a set of records about a fountain in Glasgow, which had a cherub, a little stone cherub on it with water that came out. And sometime in the 1960s, this cherub vanished. It was removed, pedestal and all, from the fountain, and just disappeared. And it was missing for 8 years, and it turned up on a rubbish heap on the other side of Glasgow. So she did this project about using records of the building of the thing, the newspaper accounts of it disappearing, the police reports that she managed to get hold of, and then its finding and restoration. And these children enacted, drew, told stories of all of the cherub's adventures over those 8 years, of where it went and what it did. And there were the most beautiful little pieces of artwork and a little performance that was put together. In this one, they're actually building their own version of the fountain, because there was a competition in Glasgow to rebuild the fountain because they wanted to sort of represent it to the public. This one down here was a project in Aberdeen where we took a primary 6th class, so these children are 10 and 11, and we took a set of records from, there were letters written by Robert Laws and his wife, whose name I can't remember terribly, who were missionaries in Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, in the from the 1870s through to the early 1900s. Went to hospital, and he trained local people in how to be nurses, how to be doctors, and how to treat disease. But he was also a missionary as well, so he did that thing. And they had this enormous mission station. They had 8 children between them. Margaret, that was her name, Margaret. So Robert and Margaret Laws. They had 8 children. After 7 of their children had died on this mission station, they decided that Amy, their last one, maybe shouldn't stay there. So they took her all the way back to Edinburgh. It took 3 months, and they sailed down the river and around and up through and so on, and they got to Edinburgh, and they dropped Amy off with Margaret's sister and said, could you just bring her up? And off they went back to Nyasaland. And then they parented her at a distance. And Aberdeen University has this file, this thick, full of all of Robert and Margaret's letters to Amy. Sadly, we don't have Amy's letters back. But they parented her from a distance from the age of 8 through to when she was an adult, around 20. sometimes 2 or 3 letters a day. And these letters are vivid descriptions of life in Africa, of the staff who worked in the compound, of the animal life, of the colours. They wanted Amy to be living their life. But there was a delay, because of course if you posted a letter in Malawi, it took a while to get back to Edinburgh. So there was one famous occasion when Amy's aunt bought her a dress to go to the ball. She was at George Watson's college when she was about 13 in Edinburgh, and they bought her a dress to go to the ball, which was in August. And on the way back from the ball, she tore her dress and got mud on it. And in January the following year, a letter arrived from her mother telling her off for getting her. Now, when we presented this to children of 11 years old, they could not fathom how did this work? How did the letter system work? This was a realization that when we're talking about letters, we have to go right back with children to explain what were letters and how did they work and how did they get from there to there. So this was, I was involved in doing the drama stuff for this. So this lad is being a lion. He's enacting part of one of Robert's letters about actually their gardener being mauled to death by a lion. Robert didn't hold back in his description. But these kids loved the gory detail as well as all of the other stuff that went with the letters. Amy went on, interestingly, to become a physiotherapist, and massage was her she did a lot of research on the use of massage with wounds. And during the First World War, she went out and trained nurses in how to massage very, very terrible wounds in the First World War to restore muscle strength and so on. And she went on, she was still practicing in Edinburgh in her 90s when she died. Extraordinary woman, actually. And there is a whole archive of her work at the Lothian Health Service, in a completely different archive in the Lothian Health Service. So that was our pilot project. I'm not doing very well with 2 minutes a slide, am I? And these were our conclusions, which in a nutshell are, there's not much communication between archives and teachers, partly because teachers don't really know, A, whether that archives exist, and B, how they work. And there is that general thing, it's probably the same here in New Zealand, that archives, museums, we can all walk in and this is great and we can look around. Archives, multiple doors in the way. And even if you get through all the doors, there's somebody folding their arms on the other side saying, what exactly is it you want to look at? So most teachers kind of, don't want to do that. Even history teachers. So there was a lack of understanding amongst teachers about what archives were and how to use them. There was a lack of confidence amongst archivists to even embark on this. There was a lack of time and resource for archivists to do this as well. So SCA decided that they should appoint me as their Education Development Officer to support archives in Scotland to be far more adventurous with education and outreach work. And we started with schools. So this was my remit to begin with. Creating resources, creating exemplar projects, training staff, so workshop days and training courses, distance learning stuff as well, so we set up a section of the website with materials. And I was also tasked, I'm still doing this, with collating the good practice that's already out there, and there's lots of good stuff already out there. Individual archive services producing good quality materials, sticking it up on their own website, no one knows it's there. So we were tasked with collating all this together, providing links or providing the actual materials. And we're still doing that. And I'm delighted with the amount of stuff that we've managed to pull together. We also run the coaching program where archive services apply for a number of days of my time, and I go and work with them individually to develop projects. And some of the projects I'm going to tell you about have come from that program. So we started with things like this. Archives in the curriculum. How exactly are archives related to the curriculum? And everyone says history. But actually, once you start digging down, as you probably know, you can use archival material in all areas of the curriculum. My particular interest is drama and active learning, and so I have used that facility a lot in developing projects, but I find that once I do that, a lot of other curricular areas begin to get absorbed into that same project. And the Scottish curriculum, a little bit like the New Zealand curriculum, encourages interdisciplinary learning. Secondary schools in Scotland are still very siloed in the way that they operate. They have siloed departments and they have a timetable, and those two things operate very powerfully against interdisciplinary learning. So often, good interdisciplinary learning only comes about when there is a special project that comes in and you get dispensation to break the timetable. And again, a couple of the projects I'm going to show you eventually are those. So what is this? Education resources. Oh yes, okay. So you can read that. I forgot this one was in there. We tried to get away from the worksheet approach. And I found that dealing with archive staff who lacked confidence to work with schools, but were really enthusiastic to talk about their work and to do outreach with their work with schools and with communities. It's only a matter of little bits of expertise. That's all you need. And then once you're off, you can produce amazing pieces of work. Also wanted to look at what's already out there. So up the top there, you've got, that's the Highland Archive in Scotland. That's an example of the sort of page that I mentioned, where an archive service has produced really good quality materials. Nobody knows it's there, unless you go through multiple clicks and links down to that page. So we pulled that out and we put those resources as PDFs on our own site. This is some materials that I've actually just finished writing, which I'll tell you a bit more about these. This is for ARA UK, and these are primary source analysis sheets for schools. So there's junior and senior versions. I'll tell you a bit more about those when we come to them. Eastern Berkshire War, that's a project I'm going to tell you about, and we created a website for that. And then down here, this is our SCA site with some of our resources on there. I can give you links to all of these sites. Docs Teach, you probably know about this one. This is the American Archives. They're about the only set of analysis tools that I can find that are easily available on the internet. And they're really good, but they're very US-centric, obviously. So these materials here are a development of their stuff. So this is the archive analysis and inspiration sheets. I was commissioned to do these by ARA UK, and the idea here is that a class or a group within a class is given a record, a written document, a map, a photograph, an artifact of some kind, and they're given this sheet, and they just work through the questions on this sheet. So here, this one here is a map. So what interesting features do you see on the map? When was it made? Where in the world is it? So it's really just an initial pass over. What do I look for? How do I interact with this thing that I've been given? And then this one is what do you do with that information once you've collected it? Once your students have analysed the document and looked for certain things. So on here we might encourage them to look for marks and stains and spots and holes and seals and annotations and so on as well. So what's the significance of all of those? So I can give you a link to these sheets as well, because I think it would be interesting to produce something that was New Zealand-centred along the same lines. These are for UK, so they're Scottish and English and Irish curriculum. all of which are quite different from each other. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the projects that I've been running as part of our coaching program around Scotland. And the first one is this one. John Alex Veitch was a young man, there he is, fresh-faced, 18, lived in Perth, in Perthshire, in Scotland, so just above Edinburgh. And in 1916, he turned 18 and he signed up and went off to the war. You would have thought by 1916 the reports coming back were enough to make somebody think twice, but in those days, loyalty and peer pressure was very powerful. And this young man went off enthusiastically to the war. And he wrote lovely letters back to his mum and dad. He wrote vivid descriptions of his experiences and how he felt about those experiences. And they tell a very familiar story of a young man with high ideals going out to join the force, only to find himself chest deep in mud and encountering a sense of hopelessness amongst his fellow soldiers, and gradually beginning to think, what is this? And becoming politicized. His letters, we are lucky that we have his mother's letters back as well. The family kept the whole lot. There's a bit of a First World War focus here because that's been my life from 2014 to 2018, because it was such a big thing in the UK and there was money for nothing else. So I did a couple of really big wartime projects. So this one, I was asked to go along to create a drama unit based on these letters, which we did. But one of the things we wanted to do was to create sound recordings of these letters, because we found young people really engaged with the letters once they could listen to them. So we got a local drama group to come down, and we set up a little recording studio in a room, and this is all my equipment, because I have an attic full of, don't talk to my wife about that. all this equipment, and it's like, well, which box? That one there's got all the audiovisual in. And we set up this thing for the day, and we got these young people in, and we did some voice training and stuff with them, and then we set them up, and we got these amazing recordings, these young voices reading these letters from the mother, from Dad didn't write many letters, he wrote a couple, and the letters from John Alex. And obviously the archivist took selections because, again, there was this thing. And the poignant one is the one that he wrote about, and it's a fairly mundane letter, about how he was going to get transferred out of the trench the next day, and he was having trouble getting his washing dry and so on. And it arrived 2 days after he died. And what we did with the drama unit was we built up to that fact. We did a 6-week thing with the kids where they did a day each week for 6 weeks, and gradually got to know John Alex, and gradually engaged with the correspondence, and we followed his journey, his thought journey as well as his physical journey around the trenches. And then the last lesson, they read this letter, and oh, here's another letter, and then we revealed that he died. And by that time, the children had identified with him, because we're talking about 15, 16-year-olds doing this. So this was somebody who was 2 years older than them, who came from the same area, for some of them the same street that they lived in Perth. And then they find out that he died. And that emotional impact makes all the difference to embedding that learning. It sounds cruel. It's not. Well, it is. But hey. So this was the sound recording, and I really liked doing this sound recording thing, because what we found in Perth is that the children who do this project engage with the letters immediately when they hear them. They've got the letter in front of them, they've got the original and a transcription, because it's terrible handwriting. Well, actually, that's not that bad, actually, is it? That's pretty good. Yeah. Okay, I take that back. Well done, John. But they've got the letter and the transcription, and then they listen to the recording, and suddenly it all comes to life. Meanwhile, in East Dunbartonshire, which is somewhere north of Glasgow, and whenever you mention anyone in Scotland, you say East Dunbartonshire, they go, it's like Cucubrishire. Who knows where that is? So East Dunbartonshire is the area north of Glasgow. There's places like Kirkintilloch is one of the main towns there. Very, very old industrial area of Scotland. And East Dunbartonshire Council asked me to produce this education resource called East Dunbartonshire's War, which is all based on archives. So they said, there's the archive, just let us know when you're finished. And I had to go in, I had to research. So I had 4 volunteer researchers to work with me, and they were fabulous. We researched the archive for good material about the war, and we found letters and diaries, but we also found committee minutes of a lot of the companies that made armaments and ships and submarines, all in that part of the world. And there were secret bases and all sorts of things that we found in the archive, and we built the whole resource on that. And it has its own website because it just became this vast, sprawling thing, and it took me 3 years to do. And one of the schools that we did the piloting in was called Douglas Academy in Mulgai. And I took the sound recording idea along, together with 2 diaries and a set of letters that I thought were just extraordinary in in the language that they used and the personal stories that they contain. And again, we set up our recording studio, and we set about getting these young people to record the diary. This typed one here. She had a typewriter. She was a nurse, and she was on the front line. So you've got CCS, Casualty Clearing Station, right up at the front line. 3 trenches back, bones and blood everywhere, and she's there in her tent with a typewriter. This was a Scottish chateau, and they took it. Scottish. It was a French chateau, and the Scottish nurses battalion organisation, whatever they were. I knew the name once. I've forgotten it. It'll come back to me. They took over the chateau, turned that into the hospital, and they put all the nurses into tents at this tent city outside. And a Zeppelin came over one night and bombed the tent city and killed a number of nurses. And Elspeth Graham was in that attack. And she wrote this incredible account of, she wrote it the night after on her typewriter in her tent, which stayed upright. And this is one of the young people reading some of them.
A beautiful Sunday night in late July. In bed, my tent mate and I chat for quite a long time. Presently, the sound of guns breaks through our conversation. The sound comes nearer and nearer, and then the cathedral bells start their agitated tolling, and one of our guns goes off with a mighty double crack. We lie very quiet now, with fast-beating hearts. Up to this time, air raids have held no terror for me, but now I begin to realise what might happen. Presently, the whir of machinery is heard overhead, and someone who's watching says, "It is just above us." Our own guns are now doing their utmost. Their noise is tremendous. All the time we lie in our beds with nothing but a sheet of canvas between us and the beyond. I turn on my side and bury my head in the pillow. My heart is racing and every muscle quivering. Never have I realised what real fear is. I think of the boys who have to endure this, sometimes days on end. On and on through all these thoughts, the crashing of artillery continues. A dog howls with fear, and someone in the next tent is sobbing and whimpering. Suddenly, there is an almighty crash which shakes the air, then another, and then silence. Presently, another bang tells us that it is not all over. I rise and put on a coat and sit on my companion's bed with jaw tightly locked to prevent my teeth from chattering. We cling together in our terror, silently shaking, enduring what seems like acute physical pain. The enemy only leaves us at 2 in the morning when the moon begins to set. Meantime, much has happened in the town where the bombs fell. Houses have been ruined and women and children killed in the streets by their own shrapnel. The operating theatre is filled to overflowing by the victims who have been brought in by our stretcher bearers. Soldiers and civilians, side by side, lie wounded and dying.
We used 2 diaries, Elspeth's diary and the diary of Kate Jeffrey, who was a woman from Kirkintilloch, who also went out, volunteered and went out to nurse and also worked on the front line. These 2 never met, but they wrote about the same battles and the same experiences. We also used a set of letters written by 3 brothers called Boyds. So there was John and Craig and James, who all at different times volunteered to go out They were a family from the area where the school is. In fact, the school is just down the road from where their family house. And all three of these boys wrote letters back to their mum and dad about their experiences. And again, their personalities come through really clearly in the letters. These three boys all survived the war. One of them, James, joined the Royal Flying Corps and crashed over enemy lines and was put in POW camp. John suffered an injury, which you'll hear more about in a minute, and spent a lot of the war being shunted from hospital to hospital around England, and then trying to figure out how to make his eye stop watering. Couldn't work out. He got a bit of shrapnel in the eye here, and they took it out, but his eye kept watering, and they couldn't work out why. And eventually, they used some newfangled thing called X-ray, and they figured out what was going on. But you'll see that in a minute. So that was Craig, that was John, Craig was the youngest, and he went out, and he also ended up in a POW camp. And they all wrote letters back, and all these letters were carefully kept in a chanter box. A chanter is the bit of the bagpipes, the wooden bit of the bagpipes. And they kept them in a chanter box. And after the war, no one wanted to talk about the war, so the chanter box was put in the attic and never seen again until all three boys, now men, died within 6 weeks of each other in 1976. And they cleared the house where John had been still living and found these letters, which they gave to Eastern Berkshire Archives. And I was the first one to dig them out and read them. And it was so moving to read these letters. So we decided, having done this sound recording, my friend Scott and I, Scott's an actor, were involved with piloting the resource in Douglas Academy, and I went to the senior teacher at Douglas Academy and said, I think this would make an amazing piece of theatre. How about it? And we managed to get funding, and so we decided to do a theatre project. We justified it with curricular outcomes. We engaged the English, drama, music, history, and guidance departments, and we said, we think there is content here for all of you. We got the community involved, and we got a selection of young people, volunteers, who agreed to give up a week of their school for us to go and work with them for a whole week. So off timetable, out of uniform, that was controversial. And they were responsible for catching up. So these were exam students, but they committed to doing it. Except one lad, who I'll tell you about in a minute. We said we only use words from the original archives, but we create a script. So we spent the first day just creating a script. I think this is us. Yeah, that's us down the bottom there, sitting around with those students, writing the script. And then this is us beginning to do some devising and blocking. So we devised the whole thing. We started on the Monday, and we did the script development, and then we presented the thing on Friday the following week after a week's work. And that's one of my specialisms that I do, instant theatre. So that's what I was doing at Auckland. We would script a stage in a week. So this is us. This is us working with these students who were fabulous to work with. So, just go back there. So that was it there. This is all the stuff they had to do. And this is them performing it. So this was performed in the school, public performance. So we had local councillors, we had the local MSP, who was a member of Scottish Parliament. We had several relatives of Elspeth and the Boyds who came along, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is that's the boy playing John with his eye injury, and this piece here with the cloth was the memorial service for the nurses who died, which I'll show you a clip of in a minute. This lad spoke to me after the first day that we were doing this, and he said, I didn't know this was drama. I thought that we were going to be just writing something, and I'm not really interested in drama. I don't want to perform. And I said that's fine. You know, we'd already said, after the first day, if you think this is not ready for me, tell us, and we'll you can walk away. So I said, you can just walk away if you like. Oh, well, I might just come along tomorrow, but I'm not going to take part. So he showed a facility for being able to look at a piece of devised work. So we would be in the room and we'd say, well, why don't we just try this out? So Elspeth comes in here, this, that, and the other. And he'd be off at the side. This typical Scottish kind of, and I could just see the little shake of the head, and he'd look away. And I said, oh, Luke, what do you think? Oh, well, no, she should come on from over there, and this cloth should be down here. And you think, he's got it. That's my job's done here. And I walk away. So he ended up performing, and Scott and I both said to him, you have a presence on stage that not many of these young people have got, but you also have this ability to look at a scene and strip out what's not needed. That's, again, my style of theatre is very minimalist. And he would just say, all we need on stage is the coat stand and that guy there. We don't need all this other stuff. And he was right every time. He spoke to us afterwards. He brought his dad along. And his dad looked very reluctant about this. But he got Scott and me to after the performance. He wanted us to tell his dad what we had told him about being this amazing performer. So we did, and I could see his dad just couldn't believe what he was hearing. So he's now at drum school in Glasgow, and I was really proud of him. You'll see him performing in a minute. So I've just got 2 short video clips for you of the actual performance. It was just a camcorder, so it's a bit shaky.
Figures, winding their weary way up the hill. Such is my impression of that walk to the cemetery. Every heart is heavy with grief, and everyone is tired. We stand in the bright sunlight, row upon row of us, waiting for the arrival of the brave ones so soon to be laid to rest. The colonel in chief arrives, and many other officers marching up the path, followed by row upon row of patients in hospital blue. Some are lame and are aided by their comrades. Some have bandaged heads and arms, but all still insisted in coming to pay their last tribute to the sisters who have died for them. Then at last, the cars arrive. Our matron enters and the sad procession begins. Borne high on the shoulders of 4 colonels and covered with the Union Jack, the coffin of the first sister comes. The others follow, also carried by our own medical officers, and we walk slowly after, through the ranks of men who line the path, each standing at attention. The burial service is a soul-stirring one. There is something great and comforting about it, and I feel at that moment, death is a fine thing. And my heart is filled with envy for those who have died so bravely, whose fears and sorrows are now over. For us, the weary, return to work, and the cold hand of fear ever on our hearts. For us, the daily toll, forcing our bodies to act. For them, peace. When the last post is played, every officer approaches and salutes the open grave, and my heart is bound with pride as I stand up straight with tears smarting in my eyes.
She's typical west of Scotland. She talks at 100 miles an hour.
So sorry I've been so long in writing. I've not been in a mood for writing owing to news I heard 3 days ago that Alex Cooper was killed in action. You'll remember Eddie Cooper. He was my chum on guard at the gun from January till I was wounded. As you know, there are always 2 men on guard at the gun at any time, as it is necessary for 2 for firing the gun. The news has upset me a bit. When I went to France and was 2 months in my company, my chums on guard were A. Farquhar and W. Laidlaw, and they had been killed, and then I went back to gun section in January, and my chum in the trenches was Alex Cooper. I've said for about 6 months that the Germans had killed my 2 chums, and I'd always looked for consolation that I had Cooper left. But now, he's gone. I'm enclosing 3 letters, and I'd like you to keep them for me until I come home, as I wish to keep them in remembrances of them. They have nobly given up their lives for their country. I'm wondering who will be taken away from me next. I received your parcel in fine condition and enjoyed the cake first rate. I remain your affectionate son, John.
John Boyd, UVF Hospital, Belfast, 7th of October 1916. Dear Mother, just a line or two to let you know I'm in the pink of condition. I get X-rayed last Monday the 2nd and was waiting until I received the results of the examination, and I think they've discovered what is the matter with my eye and head, and I think that in a week or two I will have my eye and head back to what it should be like after 18 months with my eye watering. I will be very glad to get it back to what it was before I was wounded. I'm liking the hospital life all right, and I'm quite content. Have you heard any more from Craig? I am your loving son, John.
The eye injury that John received, as I say, thing went off, shell went off, and he got shrapnel fragments in his face, and they took them all out, but his eye wouldn't stop watering. So he was transferred to hospitals all over England, and they couldn't figure this out. They said, "Oh, it'll clear, it'll be fine." He was eventually sent to Belfast, where they had a specialist unit, and they had this newfangled X-ray thing. They took an X-ray, and they discovered that there was a bullet behind his eyeball that nobody knew was there. As you heard, they figured out what they were going to do about it, and then he wrote an account to his parents of how they resolved the issue.
John Boyd, UVF Hospital, Belfast, 19th of October 1916. My dear mother, just a few lines to let you know how I'm getting on here. I had an operation at 5:45 p.m. yesterday. I was in the operating theatre from 5:45 to 6:15. I'm glad to say I was successful and got a shrapnel growth about 3/8 of an inch diameter from my head slightly above the eyes. I'm very glad to say there was no mark on my face as it was taken from inside the mouth. The doctor used all sorts of instruments up my nose until it was about off my head, as I had no chloroform or gas, but only an injection of morphia in my right arm about 2 hours before I went down. He pushed the probe up my nose, I pushed the ball into my mouth, and his hand was in my mouth and almost up to my eyes to catch the ball and thus prevent it going into the lungs. I may say it was no joke getting it removed, and I never experienced as much pain and agony in half an hour in my life before, and never want to experience it again. I was sitting on a stool. I may say that getting that piece of shrapnel out of my head should do me a lot of good. I don't expect you to believe my story when you see the shrapnel ball. You will say the same as the doctor. You are a living marvel. I don't know how you were not killed. But when I come home in a week or thereabouts, you will find me as healthy as ever, with the exception of a sore throat and forehead. I received your kind letter this morning, and I did not want Father, Blue, or yourself to know about the operation until it was over, as I do not want to cause you any trouble. I am leaving today for Guildford Convalescent Home, and shall draw to a close, hoping this finds you all well at home. Shall try and get over home before Craig leaves, and shall write to her in a day or two to let him know when I will be home. I am your loving son, John. P.S. Please excuse the writing, as I am very unsteady and my eye gets dazzled from looking long and printing. Do not worry, as I will be alright in a few days.
There was quite a bit of negotiation amongst the boys as to which one of them got to read that letter. There was some sort of fight went on behind the bike sheds, and he ended up victorious. So he got to read it. Apparently, in with that letter was the bullet fragment. But unfortunately, it never made it to the archive, so we don't have it. Quite disappointing. But sitting in the front row there, this gentleman here is Elspeth Graham's son. He was in his late 80s, and he has since died, sadly. And then these ladies here are John and James's nieces. And they travelled up from Southampton to see this. So the school organised for them to go back to the house where the boys had lived. And they hadn't been there since they were children. But we got to speak to a couple of them about their memories. They actually remembered James and John, Uncle James and Uncle John. And it was quite extraordinary to talk to them and for them to say they knew these letters, or they knew the content of these letters, but they'd never heard it read aloud or enacted. We did another version of this in fact, I think it's on here. Actually, no, I'll just go back. We did another version of this project because this was so successful. we got funding to do a project called Theatre of Remembrance, where we took similar records from different parts of Scotland, and with high schools, we produced theatre projects like this. So we produced 4 performances 2 years ago. And what was I going to say? James's daughter came to one of our performances, and the boy who was reading the first of James's letters, they came up with this amazing stage arrangement, because we get the children to do, the young people to do the devising and the staging. And they came up with this staging arrangement. It was a great big hall where they had 4 banks of seating in a poppy shape. And then they performed in the middle and down the avenues. So it was an extraordinary piece of logistics, and the kids worked all this out themselves. Well, James's daughter was sitting in the seat kind of there in this block, and the boy who was reading James's letter came, by coincidence, came and stood here and started reading one of James's letters out loud. And she said that she was shivered all over, because she said she'd never heard James's letters read in a broad Glasgow accent, the exact accent that James would have had, because this was the area where he lived. So it was intensely moving for the people who saw it. And it all comes back to archives. It all comes back to why do we keep this stuff? These are the ash pits, if you like, letters and diaries and scraps and newspaper things and receipts and so on. These are the ash pits which become the treasure. In a way that official records, it's harder to get that out. And it comes back to the selection. What do you keep? I was talking to Tom earlier about, how do you archive Facebook? How do you archive email? When there's just, you could fill the world with it. But there are no letters, there are no diaries anymore. And yet there are. Facebook and these young people who did this, we have a lot of those kind of conversations about records and how important they were. 2 of the students who did this particular project went on to do history because of this project at university, and one of them went to drama school. And we were proud of that. These are some of the comments that we had back from the students and from the teachers. I love that first comment. The fact that they embodied these people who had written, these people who are dead, who had written this stuff in scratchy pencil on crispy, nasty paper with mud on it. Some of the letters actually had trench mud, which makes me shiver. For them to say that about an archive record, I think is really powerful. As I said, we got funding to do this again in 2018. So this is just some pictures of the other schools with local records again. So we had another school in Eastern Berkshire, we had a school in Edinburgh and a school in Aberdeen, each doing their own records of people who came from the streets around about their school. Nurses, soldiers. Now, the Aberdeen one, which is this one here, this was interesting because we arrived at the school, we left the school to do the selection of students. We arrived at the school and the librarian who was organising it said, it's all girls who have volunteered for this, is that okay? And we looked at each other and we thought, oh right, we've got all of these letters from soldiers, and how do we do this gender thing? So we sat down with these girls and said, how do you want to do this? Let's just read through all the stuff, how do you want to do this? And they said, A, can we have a woman's perspective on this? And B, can we think of imaginative ways to read these soldiers' letters which still respect the content, but which give a woman's perspective on it? And they came up with a really interesting devised piece which had girlfriends and wives and mothers reading these letters rather than the people who had written them. And the audience found that very moving. It gave them a whole different perspective on records. The last one I want to tell you about, if this will work. Yep, there it is. is last year I got back from my New Zealand trip, and a friend of mine who is the archivist for the Duke of Argyll, so that's the sort of west part of Scotland, got in touch and said, I'm going over to the island of Tiree, which is this little treeless island out in the Atlantic somewhere, this part of Scotland, with a set of records related to Tiree. We're doing archive workshops, we're doing 2 exhibitions, and then we thought it would be great to do some work with the school. There's a school on Tiree. There's only about 300 people live there, but they've got the school. The smallest secondary school in Scotland, 35 kids. Plus a primary school with, would you believe it, 78 kids. So we've got this school. They were keen to do some stuff with us. So I went and I spent the week doing archive drama sessions using stories from these records. And one of them was the story of a mermaid being found on the beach at Greenold in Tiree. And we know about this because there is a court deposition which is lodged at the High Court in Edinburgh. The story is that some children found the body of a mermaid on the beach in 1803. And they went and got a man who was working in the fields, and they said, we found this mermaid. And he said, and he went down there and he said, well, there's a mermaid here. And he went and got his brother, and they didn't know what to do, and they finally decided to give it a Christian burial, which they did. They buried it. The story went around the island. Well, at that time, there were stories of mermaid sightings going on all over Tiree and all over the Argyll Peninsula. And the local sheriff, who turns out to be the great something grandfather of J.K. Rowling, what are the odds, in 1803, an inspired man, I think in many ways, he decided this may lead to accusations of witchcraft. This may lead to some mass hysteria kind of a thing, so we need to sort of deal with this. Rather than saying, don't be so stupid, he said, everyone who's seen a mermaid, I'm going to hold court depositions, and we are going to listen to your story, and we're going to record it all, and it's all going to get lodged in the High Court in Edinburgh. And he did that, and nothing else was done, but those papers are all still there. On Tiree, it went a step further, because the deposition says the judge on Tiree listened to the story, and he said, that's fascinating. My brother is a doctor. So you are going to take us, and we're going to dig this body up, and we're going to examine it. Which they did, apparently. They went to Greenold, they dug the body up, and the doctor said, yes, this is indeed a mermaid. And that was all recorded and sent off to the High Court in Edinburgh, and then they reburied it. We don't know where it is, but we have this story. And the children, this was them doing, there's the mermaid. See the mermaid up there? I literally had 4 days back in the country. And then I had to throw a whole lot of stuff in the back of the car and drive over to Tiree, which takes a long time, I'll tell you, 7 hours. So the skull, which sits in my study, I threw that in because I thought, you always need a skull. And a whole lot of costumes and so on. And we did all these workshops. Well, these kids here, these ones, who are the primary 7s, the oldest ones, who are about 12, 13, they wanted to, can we do a performance? They said, on Thursday, and we were finishing on Friday. And I thought, we've got 6 hours. Yeah, we can do a performance. So we improvised this performance of this whole story, the children and the worker and the court and the doctor and everything. And they wanted to do it as a promenade. So we did this promenade performance around the local village hall, and about 110 people came to see it. And we got, yeah, there's the document about the mermaid. But that's nice writing.
Great title for the movie.
Yeah. And inspired by that, the local community there has now put in for funding to do a much bigger arts project, which we're hoping we're going to do this summer. So this is the other stuff I'm involved in right now. This is what's coming up this year. Again, through my SCA work. And I apologise, I've talked for a whole hour. So I will stop now. Thank you.